just want to follow up with you and discuss the issue of the executive branch overreaching. We've seen in the last even few days things like a Christmas tree tax and other things implemented by the Agriculture Department. You've seen it just an expansion, a massive expansion of these powers that are not created by law. How would you shut this down, stop it? How would you work to do that?
Well, you can do it as a president because you can repeal rules, you can repeal regulations. The president doesn't have to go through Congress to get any of that done. So that, in the short term, you can deal with that situation. The problem is the long-term problem that you have when the next Obama comes into power and goes about the business of using that to expand his authority and be able to do the things that are clearly beyond what the American public wants. And the reason they can do that, and I think, I'm sure Newt will agree with me on this, is the way that legislation is written in America today. You have these very complex pieces of legislation written very broadly and vaguely. One of the things that I wish I could say I captured this early in my career, I did, but one of the things that I focused on toward the end of my legislative career is understanding that, and use the NLRB for example. That's a popular example that's used out there. What's an unfair labor practice? Well, read it. It's incredibly broad. And it leaves an enormous amount of discretion for the regulators to decide. That's exactly the way the left likes to write bills. They like to write it with a bunch of shall, the secretary shall. I forget in Obamacare, I knew it at one point. I think there were 700 times in Obamacare where the secretary shall, those words appeared. It's written to leave enormous discretion to those in the executive branch to implement it. It's almost as if you say, well, here's what we generally want to do, and you go ahead and do what you want. It's exactly how the left writes. That's how and a president, Santorum, will say, look, let's go back and look at a lot of these laws, and a lot of them are up for what's called reauthorization. Let's focus on narrowing the scope and actually having Congress either make the decision as to what something should be, or if you can't, then cut it out. We have no business making the decision at all.
Same question. How would you shut down the process of the executive branch and parts of the executive branch basically writing their own laws?
Well, I think Brett's pretty close to right on this. You have to establish a new culture of accountability in which the Congress writes much narrower, much more directed laws. You also have to look into the notion of allowing citizens to defend themselves. All too many of these administrative agencies have no right of appeal beyond the agency, and so the burden against the individual citizen is so massive that if that agency decides to pay attention to you, you're in desperate trouble because it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to stand up to them, and therefore they have all the advantages. And I think we have to fundamentally rethink the regulatory state that began in the New Deal and just expand it very, very dramatically, starting with Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. It's now become an entire culture in Washington, and it's made worse by the rise of the word processor, because nowadays you can have staff sitting there at 2 o'clock in the morning writing thousands of words of obscure material which only they understand. And then we say, but the Congress voted on it. Well, the Congress was given a mound of material. Dodd-Frank is 2,300 pages, and I believe it has 400 regulations on top of the 2,300 pages. Obamacare is 2,700 pages and will probably ultimately generate 100,000 pages of regulation. Nobody in Congress has a clue what that means. And so you really have to reshape the Congress. And I agree with Greg, we have not seen an aggressively conservative president since Calvin Coolidge. I mean, we had strong conservatives. Eisenhower was pretty conservative. Reagan was pretty conservative. But they didn't go out and pick fights domestically over this kind of structural stuff. If you had the equivalent of a Calvin Coolidge, it would be fascinating to watch the level of shock. And, well, just as this one observation that Rick made that I had not thought about till this evening. The president who says to the Congress, if you don't reauthorize it on time, I'm going to assume it's lapsed, and we're going to close it. would play just enormous pressure. What they do now is they play games. They continue it. In some cases, they continue it for 5 or 6 years. They haven't reauthorized it. They just sort of say, we're going to get around to it soon. And the president said, oh no, get the job done on time or I'm going to assume that agency's gone. Would just cause enormous pressure in companies. It'd be like watching a giant pressure cooker build. It'd be almost worth the price of admission just to be able to watch how hard it
GrokTV.